This lecture covers a mere 1 million years of our past. It picks up the story from 3 million years ago and ends about 2 million years before present. It covers one of the most important and still least understood periods of human prehistory. First, we're going to describe the 3 major forms of hominid that we know of that split off from earlier lines about 3 million years ago. And for the first time, we're going to encounter humans, a branch of hominids which are known generically as Homo, but include the first well-identified human, Homo habilis, probably the first hominid to make stone tools. Tool making, as we all find out, is one of the defining characteristics of humankind. In the second part of the lecture, I'm going to describe the salient features of Homo habilis, and we'll find out that it was more ape-like than human in its behavior. Then we'll go on and describe Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania and the celebrated sites and tools from there which paint a portrait of our earliest ancestors as scavengers and foragers. And lastly, I'll define the fundamental differences between Homo and other hominids 2.5 million years ago, when the very first archaeological sites appear. Archaeological sites is defined by being present there evidence for human behavior and tool making. And we'll conclude that a vast chasm separated these, our earliest forebears, from the very first true humans who appeared about 2 million years ago. As we said in the last lecture, 3 million years ago, a great diversity of hominids flourished in tropical Africa, notably in the open country of East, Central, and Southern Africa. That's not to say that one day we'll find more hominids elsewhere, but at the moment, these are the areas we're most known from. These, as I said in the last lecture, were known as the Australopithecines, various forms of the hominid first identified by Raymond Dart in 1924. Between 3 and 2 million years ago, there were at least 3 main forms of hominid. Now, these broad categories I'm going to give you actually probably disguise many lesser-known forms, some of whom have not yet even been identified. The original form found by Raymond Dart in 1924 was Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape human of Africa. This was a very small, gracile hominid, very lightly built, with a small, delicate skull and a face with a snout, a prognathous face. Didn't stand very high. It was very nimble and clearly highly mobile. But very little else is known about this small creature, but it appears to have been an evolutionary dead end, one of the branches of the bush which ended. Sometime after the discovery of Australopithecus africanus, a much more robust form was found. This was named Australopithecus robustus on account of its heavy, squat build and its massive skull with a crest on the back which helped support the jaw. These hominids also had small brains and teeth which were adapted for chewing coarse, fibrous plant matter. These apparently were plant eaters. Now, both Australopithecus robustus and africanus were thought 40 years ago to be the first tool makers. People who fashioned tools, and Raymond Dart thought that they used bones to club animals and to break bones. But in fact, subsequent research has shown that the bones which Dart thought were made into tools by Australopithecus were in fact chewed and dropped by hyenas. It's very difficult to identify the earliest tools because really the only material which survives in the archaeological record is durable material like stone. And if there's one comment about human prehistory, it is written in durable materials, stone tools, potsherds, and so on. Our knowledge of human behavior is very incomplete. I vividly remember in 1960 meeting the famous South African anatomist Philip Tobias in an airport. And we sat down and had lunch, and he said to me in the middle of lunch, "We have handy person." And I looked at him and said, "Run that past me again." And he said, "We have handy person, Homo habilis." And he explained to me that Louis and Mary Leakey, and this has yet been announced publicly, had just discovered a remarkable hominid at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. It was a small, gracile hominid with thin bones, but a rather more rounded skull and more human characteristics than the Australopithecines. You should remember that a year earlier, Mary Leakey had discovered a robust Australopithecus at Olduvai Gorge. This was a dramatically different creature. It wasn't with such heavily built bones. It was lighter, more nimble, and it was found on a surface in the middle of a scatter by a lake bed of stone tools and broken animal bone fragments. Louis Leakey had confidently identified, immediately he discovered this animal, that Homo habilis was the first toolmaker, the very first hominid ever to manufacture stone tools. Now, the point about this is that we know that chimpanzees, for example, use sticks which they chew to dig grubs out of anthills. We also know from research in West Africa that chimpanzees take stones, may even flake them a bit, and use them to pound nuts to get at the fruit within. And that they'd done this for many generations. But this is not the same as making a stone tool, because stone tools made by Homo habilis and other hominids were very much more complex than these simple chippings by chimpanzees. So, Tobias, who was retained to look at the fossils, said that this creature, unlike Australopithecus, was the toolmaker, the first human, whence Homo habilis. This name has stuck. Whether or not there were other creatures in the same group called generically Homo as Homo habilis is being debated. At the moment, we simply do not know. In this part of the course, we're going to talk a lot about a site called Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai Gorge is a huge gash in the world-famous Serengeti Plains in East Africa, which are famous for their game, their huge herds of game, of wildebeest and other animals, which are a mecca for tourists today. The same landscape where a shallow lake flourished 2 million years ago was a paradise for game from the beginning of human history. And then somewhere around 100,000 years, an earthquake caused a huge gully or gorge to be cut through the Serengeti Plains, hundreds of feet deep. The sides of this gorge exposed the deposits of a shallow lake which formed and dried and formed and dried over many hundreds of thousands of years. And it was by the side of this lake some of the earliest known humans once stopped butchered animals, and moved on. Olduvai Gorge was found by a German butterfly hunter in the year 1908. He rejoiced in the name of Wilhelm Catwinkel. But it was not until the 1920s that it was discovered that Olduvai Gorge was an extremely rich source of fossil animal bones. And it wasn't until 1931 that Louis Leakey, arguably the most famous paleoanthropologist with his wife Mary of all time, discovered the first stone tools at Olduvai Gorge. Louis Leakey was prophetic. He was a man of great instinct, and instinct is something that an archaeologist needs to be successful. And he said that one day, and I heard him myself say this as late as 1958, that one day fossil humans would be found at Olduvai. Not only would you find the fossils, but you would also find evidence of their activities. Now, Olduvai is a stratified set of lake beds, and these lake beds formed in very still water. And at places in them, the Leakey discovered places where there were scatters of stones and animal bones which covered about the space of the studio. Very thin, obviously occupied for a very short time. And it was on these floors where there were choppers and flakes from stone and broken animal bones that Leakey said one day we will find a hominid. And in 1959, Mary Leakey discovered the fossil of a robust Australopithecus, which she called Australopithecus boisei, after a Mr. Boys, who was the philanthropist who paid for their research, which in fact is a robust Australopithecus, one of the three categories which we mentioned earlier in the lecture. Was this the toolmaker? The discovery of Homo habilis in a layer slightly below the year after strongly suggested that it was Homo habilis that was the toolmaker. And then in 1960 also, for the first time, potassium argon dating was used and proved that the bottom level of Olduvai Gorge was 2 million years old. And that Australopithecus boisei was 1.75 million years ago. At the time, it was thought that human origins dated back maybe 500,000 years. So as you can imagine, this was a pretty revolutionary discovery. But if you contemplate that since then, since 59, human origins have gone back to 2.5 million years, it's pretty dramatic. Homo habilis generally was agreed to be dated at Olduvai to about 1.8 million, just above the 2 million layer level. What did this human look like? It was about 4 feet 3 inches tall. Judging from the bones that have been found, it weighed about 88 pounds, was a slender bipedal hominid that looked very much like an Australopithecine. But the head was higher and rounder. The face protruded less, and the jaw was smaller. Not only that, but this hominid had a larger brain than Australopithecus. It had more curved hands, which were good for gripping. Think if you manipulate a pebble, how you turn it in your hands. If you hold it in one and you flake with another hammerstone, you're manipulating. And it also had in its hands opposable thumbs, which enabled it to manipulate small objects and to make stone tools. This find was found on, or part of, an artifact and animal bone scatter. And the Leakeys, and these were simpler times, described these as living floors, as camps, as the first home bases for humans ever discovered. Is this in fact correct? Much of the new research has been dedicated to finding out. Homo habilis' skeletal anatomy gives a mosaic picture, both of apes and humans. Homo habilis had longer arms for climbing in trees. It was adept at climbing. Could it therefore have slept in trees, safe or comparatively safe from predators, rather than living on the ground where it would have to camp on a living floor? Almost certainly, looking at the anatomy, it spent quite a lot of time in trees, and its behavior may have been more like that of an ape than a human. Our scientific predecessors thought of human evolution as a gradual and progressive mechanism. But the Australopithecines, Homo, and their predecessors, now known from recent discoveries, show a very different picture. There were long periods of relative evolutionary stability. Then there were bursts of sudden change caused by new selective pressures resulting from altered circumstances, such as environmental change or alterations in the organization itself, the organism itself. Such a rapid change may have occurred between 3 and 2.5 million years ago. This is one of the critical periods of human prehistory. Who then was the first human? Controversy rages, as it does with so much of paleoanthropology, where there are few finds. It rages not only over the definition of what is anatomically a member of the genus Homo, but over the relationship also between different hominids 3 million years ago. Enough is known today to divide the hominids after 3 million years ago, and I stress after, not before, into two very broad groups. The first of these groups comprises the Australopithecines and Homo habilis. I use the name here for convenience. All of these hominids have a low body mass and a skeleton which combines bipedalism with an ability to climb in trees. The second group includes all later human forms, including ourselves. We have a larger body mass, a modern human-like physique that functioned well in open country, and only limited ability at climbing. A vast chasm, anatomically and behaviorally, separates these two groups, with the second group appearing in Africa about 1.9 million years ago. Before that date, human behavior was much more ape-like than human. And this break between the two occurred somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago. Whether it was almost immediately after Homo habilis appeared or somewhat later, we do not know. For many years, paleoanthropologists assumed that the first humans were somewhat similar to modern living hunter-gatherers in areas like the Kalahari Desert, where the San live to this day. They argued that the earliest humans had base camps, that males hunted and scavenged meat, and females collected plant foods. This assumption came from research into modern-day hunter-gatherers, and was also based on the assumption that the Olduvai living floors, quote-unquote, were in fact campsites where people ate and slept. In fact, modern research has suggested something very different. This research isn't done in the field. It's done in the laboratory. It is done by studying very intensely the cut marks, fracture patterns on the bones found on the Olduvai floor. This research has shown that the bones at these scatters had a very complex history after they were dropped there. Many of them were fractured, and then on top of it you find marks from the teeth of hyenas. I told you before, these people were living in a predator-rich environment. And probably what they did, and to establish this, people have gone out and actually observed lions and hyenas killing and scavenging meat, is that the earliest humans weren't themselves skillful hunters, but they were expert scavengers. Consider the scenario. You've got people living in trees, maybe sleeping in trees, observing the ground. They see a kill by a lion. The lion eats its fill, or the pride of lions. Around are hyenas and other predators. The hominids see a moment. They dash out, frantically collect meat and break it up with choppers and carry this away to a location near the lake. There they quickly butcher and cut up the meat they have and eat. Then they drop it and move on, because not far away perhaps hyenas are hovering, waiting to move in. They move away elsewhere. Maybe they sleep in trees, we don't know. But then the hyenas move in. They achieved this quick scavenging and butchery, and I think they are probably right that you're talking about scavenging, by using a very simple but highly effective stone technology, studied originally by Mary Leakey. She wrote about chopping tools, crude cobbles from which a few flakes had been fractured, which were used with their jagged edges to slice meat and dismember it. In fact, more recent research has shown that it wasn't so much the cobbles that mattered, it was the flakes struck off them. The sharp edges were extremely effective for scraping meat and cutting sinew and dismembering bones, quickly and efficiently. They literally were just chips of stone, large flakes about this size, with a sharp edge, which were used like this and then thrown away. This technology, which has been reconstructed by painstaking experiments by modern-day archaeologists actually replicating these tools, was much more sophisticated than it appears. It shows a detailed knowledge of the stone. It's known as the Older One, after, of course, Olduvai Gorge. It was a technology that was first used about 2.6 million years ago, endured right up to 2 million years ago and maybe later. What then are the earliest evidence of tool making? The earliest archaeological sites of all come from Ethiopia and the eastern shores of Lake Turkana. The earliest known tools come from a site called Gono in Ethiopia, which dates to about 2.6 million years ago. But the earliest human behavior is best known from archaeological sites on the eastern shores of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. At a place called Kubifora, an ancient dry stream bed yielded the remains of antelope carcasses which had been scavenged and butchered by a small group of hominids. They used only the simplest of stone artifacts for the purpose. Shady trees overhung the site in those days and provided shade for those who scavenged and cut up the carcasses. A hastily used place which certainly wasn't a central place. It was, as it were, a stopping point. How then did Homo habilis behave? Were these hominids more ape-like than human, as many researchers believe, or did they behave differently in some ways? There were three significant differences between apes and early hominids. Firstly, hominids were bipedal, a posture that was far more effective carrying meat and objects, like artifacts. Secondly, they were adapted to open savanna living, where they had to organize themselves to cover far larger territories. As time went on, our remote ancestors became more and more dependent on technology. So the casual, opportunistic artifacts, the choppers and flakes of the first humans, like Homo habilis, became far more sophisticated, standardized artifacts after 1 million years ago. Thirdly, the larger brain of Homo habilis allowed for a much greater social intelligence, which allowed our ancestors to cope with a number of things. The complexities of living in larger groups, in close juxtaposition to one another. And remember that this theme is going to come back again and again in this course. It's the problems of social interaction, of living in small groups, then of living in settled villages, even of large cities, which is going to be one constant litany in this course, that our social abilities are terribly, terribly important to understanding the past. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the future course of human evolution may well have been a consequence of the fact that our early ancestors had to be more and more socially adept. And we will see in the next lecture just how important this adeptness was. In this lecture, though, we've described the 3 hominid forms known to have flourished in East Africa after 3 million years ago. We once again made the point that hominid populations were much more diverse than one might suspect at this time. Then we described the earliest known human, Homo habilis, a member of the genus Homo, with a thin skull, higher forehead, larger brain capacity, and perhaps the ability to make stone tools. This made a large chasm between Homo habilis and the Australopithecines. We looked very briefly at the archaeological evidence for tool making, the controversy about living floors, which in fact probably weren't living floors at all, but were just places where people went, perhaps habitually, to butcher and cut up the meat they had scavenged from kills. They may have only been there an hour or less, chased away by predators or simply on the move to minimize the risk of becoming lunch themselves. We looked also at the earliest technology in the world, a technology of choppers and flakes which needed a remarkable familiarity with stone and was in its simplicity not only the ancestors of much more advanced technologies, but highly effective in the world in which it was used, so much so that it flourished for a long, long period. And finally, we looked at the behavior and social organization of the early hominids. We concluded they were more ape-like, but probably were more socially adept. They did not have fully articulate speech, but their abilities of communication by grunting and by gesturing were probably more advanced than those of the other hominids. They had to be. Why? Simply because they had to be socially adept, and they were living in the open. 2 million years ago, the few humans on Earth lived in tropical Africa south of the Sahara Desert. Africa was the cradle of humankind, as Darwin pointed out as long ago as 1871. There was little at the time to distinguish them from the many other forms of hominid who were living alongside them. But gradually, these other forms became extinct, and only the genus Homo survived to evolve into the first true humans, classified generically and probably inaccurately as Homo erectus, the humans whom we'll describe in Lecture 4.